Alrighty, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another podcast. Today we're having on Mr. Blake Bell, but before we get into that, I want to ask you guys to please go ahead and subscribe, as almost 70% of the people who watch my podcast are not subscribed. It helps my channel grow. It keeps me motivated to keep making these videos. So if you could do that, it's free. Right below you, it's the red button. Thank you guys so much for doing that, and have a great day. Alrighty, what's going on, everybody? I'm back with another podcast. Today we're having on one of my top 3 favorite educators of all time, Mr. Blake Bell, and that's saying a lot since I only had him for like half a semester, thanks to COVID. But I'll let him give a little background about himself, and then we'll get rolling.
Hey, Sam, thanks for having me on. Yeah, like you had mentioned, unfortunately, we only had about a half a semester. I was looking forward to getting back in class after spring break, but COVID kind of had other plans for us all. So my background, well, I didn't take a traditional route to get where I'm at by any means. Way back a million years ago when I first started in college, I had designs on psychology and ended up getting my degree in psychology and finished my undergraduate work back in 2003. After that, I still was kind of, I don't know what I want to do, where I'm going to go. So I joined the Air Force and ended up in the Air Force for 4 years. After that, I came out and decided history was where I really wanted to focus, and actually came back to SEC to talk to one of my old history instructors there. And Mr. Evans, shout out to Mr. Evans, he was awesome. And he told me something interesting when we were having a conversation. He said, if he had to do all over again, he would have went into the National Park Service to start with. And I was like, no, I'd never thought about that. I never thought about being a public historian, which is what those individuals are called. So that's what I set my mind to, was getting into the National Park Service when I finished my grad school work. And that's what I did. I ended up working at a place called Homestead National Monument of America out in Beatrice, Nebraska, for the better part of 5 years, and enjoyed my time out there. Family circumstances ended up bringing me back to Burlington, and while I was here, I met with an individual that, a family friend that works at SCC, who asked me if I'd ever considered teaching. I thought, no, but I got some time on my hands and I just jumped into it, loved it, and been doing it since 2017.
Yeah, awesome. So it's safe to say that you probably didn't always want to be a teacher, or even ever saw yourself as a teacher.
No, never saw myself as a teacher. I did find that when I was doing my work in Nebraska, I would do guest lectures, I would go speak for various organizations, and I gave public presentations quite often out there. And I found I really liked that aspect of the job. I really enjoyed standing up in front of groups and audiences. And next thing I know, when I started doing teaching in a more formal setting at SCC, it felt a lot like that. It's a lot more in depth at that level as far as teaching goes, but really it just transitioned very, very nicely for me, and I enjoy it. Now I look back and think, man, I wish I would have started doing this a long time ago.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit about what you did at the Park Service. Like, what was maybe a day in the life of you back then?
Yeah, I wore a lot of different hats when I was in the Park Service. I was the historian there, and basically every day what I would be, I guess, going into it thinking would be, I would have some time set aside to do some research on the various aspects of the story that we were telling. And the story we were telling was the history of westward expansion in the United States, with a focus on what was called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was legislation passed in 1862 that gave away 160 acres of public land to individuals willing to go out, live on it, and make improvements through agricultural means. And if they did that, then they were given the land at the end of that 5-year time period. So yeah, it appears that it was free, but the sweat, the blood, the tears, and everything that went into it exacted its toll. So I would focus my research on the different people who were involved in this, not necessarily the politicians and the elite at the top. What I was really focused on were the actual people digging in the ground. And more specifically, I focused on the marginalized groups, those who have traditionally been marginalized in history. So, for example, immigrants that came to the country who were participating, Black Americans who had recently been freed after the end of the Civil War, because this legislation was passed actually during the Civil War, and then women who were participating, trying to really, I guess, increase their participation in the social and economic dream that America affords people. So that was really what I would do. But then you would talk, I would get programs on a regular basis, usually monthly programs, depending on what was being acknowledged that month. So, for example, March is Women's History Month, and I would give a program on the aspect of women participating in this, and actually went back out there this past March and gave a program for the park and their visitors. I also worked very closely with the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Center for Great Plains Studies. We would do a symposium every other year to really bolster new scholarship in that field. And I sat on many committees. I've been to various places. I was also what they call the National Historic Preservation Officer, which is a fancy way of saying that I would make sure that all of the regulations were being followed as far as when something goes onto the National Register of Historic Places. A lot of people don't realize, but the National Park Service actually runs that program. So anything that happened at our park, or sometimes even in the Midwest region, that needed somebody to come out and make sure that all the guidelines were being followed, I would be the one who would do that. So I did a lot of different stuff, and my favorite was interacting with the public, because we are a public park. People were coming in and all the time, every day. And if there was ever a question that one of our rangers couldn't answer, they'd call me up. I would come up and interact. And that was probably my favorite part of the whole job.
Yeah. So you said you started teaching in 2017, I think you said. So this has probably developed slowly over time, or maybe you knew going into it what you wanted to do. But what would you say your teaching philosophy is?
Oh, yeah, that's definitely developed over time. I guess my initial teaching philosophy was don't fail. I was like, I want to make sure that the information I'm providing my students was accurate and different from whatever they had heard through the traditional histories that they've been taught in their schools. Because that was what always meant the most to me when I took classes, was learning that history that has been either marginalized or left out completely. So primarily, though, what I wanted to do was connect history to students, because so many students come into history courses with very little interest. I'm not going to lie. And one of the reasons they do that is because in school systems, they get what I call the root memorization course of study, where you're taught dates, names, places, and all you have to do is memorize them, take the exam, and then you dump that information. And it's not real easy for students to connect to that. And as population changes and we get more diverse as a country and really as a community here, those histories have to change as well. You have to be able to connect students to history in order for them to actually care. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything to them. And it's just going to be another exercise in memorization, take the exam, dump it. So my primary goal is to always connect students to the history, and whether it's anecdotal stories, whether it's focusing on an aspect of history that has been left out, however I can do it, that I try to make sure that students have something personally invested in it. And at the end of the day, an instructor is only as good as the student's feedback and their response to the material. So for me to be a good instructor, I need my students to actually have a good response to the material, and then I know that I'm actually succeeding.
Yeah, and I could safely say that you definitely uncovered some hidden gems in terms of stories and history, and also it was really refreshing to have a history teacher that focused on the people rather than the figureheads or remembering the dates or the acts and stuff like that. So it's extremely refreshing. But why would you say it's important to learn history?
For me personally, this is what happened with me. This is my own personal journey. I had a lot of questions. I wanted to know why things were the way they were right now. When you stop for a moment and you take a look around the world, and whether it's political or social or economic, whatever the ip is that you want to know more about, or you want to know why it is the way that it is, I started finding I would look in the recent past. Okay, so whether that's a month ago, a year ago, and find the answer. Well, what ended up happening was I started asking that next question. Well, why was it like that 10 years ago? Next thing I know, I start backtracking through time, and all of a sudden, what's going on today made so much more sense. And one of the courses I teach is Asian history, modern Asian history, and one of the focal points, one of the topics that I talk about is Western Asia, better known as the Middle East. So many people know about the war, the tension, the violence that takes place in the Middle East right now, but how many people really know why? They just know it's happening, and it's too easy for me to just write it off as terrorism or religious fanaticism, things that a lot of people just assume is the cause of that. And when you start going deeper into the history, past if you start going deeper than the last year, the last decade, the last 50 years, then all of a sudden the picture is painted for you, and it makes a whole lot more sense. And I find that if we know our history, it's so much, I guess it gives us such a better advantage when we are dealing with people today. When we're looking around our environment today, it makes so much more sense. I don't like walking around in a fog and not knowing what's going on, or having people tell me what I should believe or what the story is. I would rather know for myself and use my own brain to think about these issues and try to find the answers myself.
Yeah, because I mean, when you look back at history, especially like now, especially politically, there's a reason why the United States is allies with certain people and enemies with other people. I mean, there's a historical reason why. It just wasn't like that. It just didn't start like that. And I mean, yeah, looking back into history and understanding those things can help solve the problem so much easier, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just making those connections. When I teach my modern Asian history class, right at the very beginning, I always ask my students some very important questions. Why are we? Why do we have our relationship with North Korea that we have? Why is Japan such a close ally of ours when we dropped 2 atomic bombs on them? Why are we so economically tied to China? And it's just too easy to let the talking heads that come on nightly tell you what to believe or what to think, when you could actually do a little bit of legwork. It doesn't require much. Do a little bit of legwork and figure this stuff out for yourself. And the answers are always in history. They're always there.
Yeah. So a common answer to that question, why is history important, is so we don't repeat it. What's your opinion on that?
I'm not a big believer in that one. I think if that was the truth, if we actually did learn from our mistakes, then you wouldn't have had a World War II. You wouldn't have had we wouldn't be in Gulf War II. These kinds of different things. We see atrocities committed time and time again. We see the same, whether it's environmental mistakes, whether it's social mistakes, all of these different things that take place that wouldn't happen if we actually learned from the past. And but we're human. We're human. My personal thought is we can use the past to better understand how our actions today are going to affect generations down the road. Greed, power, these kinds of different things that drive human beings are always there. They're just there. And it's these individuals aren't learning from history. They're just going to use history to their advantage. And I just find that to say that it's going to help us not repeat it isn't necessarily true. What it's going to do is learning it's going to help us maybe stop and think about what is going to happen if we make these decisions. And one example that I always like to use for this is the atomic bomb. I always ask my students, should we have dropped the atomic bomb in Japan? And as heartbreaking as that actually was, and as devastating as that actually was for the people of Japan, specifically Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if there is a silver lining in all of that, we realize how devastating it is. There hasn't been an atomic bomb dropped since then. People have been reluctant to use it just because they know what the effects are, and the bombs that we have now make those first 2 bombs dropped, look like slingshots compared to the capacity, the destructive capacity of the bombs that we have now. So I don't know. That's just one example that we maybe have learned a little bit, but does that mean that one will never be dropped again? I don't know. I'm not a fortune teller.
Yeah, that's a actually extremely interesting point to think about, is that imagine a history where we never did drop the bombs, but we still have that technology to where maybe down the line, Russia, the Cold War happens. They have like hundreds of nukes. We have hundreds of nukes, and we don't know the real destruction of them. And, we launch one towards them, and then they launch 10 towards us. And then, so maybe historically it's obviously a tragedy, but maybe it made us realize, like you said, not to do it again. But.
Yeah, and hopefully maybe that is a bit of learning from the past and not repeating our mistakes. And if you get into the alternate history of what could have happened had those not have been dropped, there would have been a point where atomic weapons would have been used. As a former member of the military and a person of history, anytime a military gets a new toy, gets a new weapon, guess what they want to do? They want to use it. So yeah. It wouldn't have been a matter of if it was going to happen. It would have been a matter of when it's going to happen.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about history then. What would you say your favorite time period in history is?
Oh boy. That fluctuates so often, but
you can start with the United States and then we could do world if you want.
Yeah, as far as United States history, it's really that post Civil War. Actually, it's really late antebellum as we ran up to the Civil War, and then the post-Civil War, basically through the 1980s. I know that's a broad stroke, but there's so many fascinating things that are happening as the United States is really getting an identity, and they're in the late antebellum period going into the Civil War, and then this post-Civil War rebuilding of the nation, or Reconstruction as it was called. Seeing the United States navigate that path has always been fascinating to me. But if I had to really narrow it down, it would probably be that post-Civil War through the Industrial Revolution, through the 1920s, probably through World War I. That's kind of my favorite part to look at.
Yeah, and I know that the Civil War Reconstruction is extremely interesting, and you were actually the first history class that we ever even talked about that. It's just we talked about the Civil War, how it ended, Union won, and then voila, it was like the United States was whole again. But it wasn't at all like that. No. It took years and years to actually glue the country back together.
And some would even say we're still working on it. We're still in the process of trying to rebuild our nation. We're young. We're really young. I think in the world that we live, as a nation, we're young. In the world we live in, where it used to be 5 minutes to 5 minutes, now it's about 5 seconds to 5 seconds, things get your attention. And recent history seems more distant than it actually is. But in the timeline, this historical timeline, we're pretty young, and we are still learning how to put our nation back. And when it fractured the way that it did, and then enters that Reconstruction period for 12, 13 years, that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough to really mend the wounds that were created by the Civil War. And it definitely didn't achieve its ultimate goals, which, well, I mean, let's face it, which was to make America a place of equality. And there were what they called radical Republicans that were attempting to create a atmosphere of equality, but it just never materialized. And our nation is, quite frankly, still trying to navigate those same issues that we were dealing with post-Civil War.
Yeah, so let's talk about this a little bit, because this is interesting. You just said radical Republicans were trying to make the nation equal. And I'm not stereotyping any political party or any political belief or anything like that. But the Republican Party, at least 10 years ago, were not for gay marriage, while the Democratic Party was. So it would seem like there was a political shift there. So maybe talk a little bit about the realignment of Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the Republican Party, as it exists today, is not the Republican Party that Lincoln was a part of, and the subsequent post-Civil War individuals were a part of. There's a tendency for them to say Party of Lincoln and the Grand Old Party and those kinds of things, but it's not 100% truthful. Those Republicans from that time period were very liberal, very progressive, very forward-thinking in their political, social, and economic views. There was a shift that does take place, and this is roughly around the teens, the 20s, when the Republican Party becomes more traditional. They become what we would say more conservative, and they start to align with the conservative values of the day, whether it was religious, social, or economic. And the Democratic Party becomes the party of the working man. And that's really what happens here. That's where the shift takes place, is the Democratic Party had absorbed what was called the Populist Party. and the Populist Party had these their political platform was things like 8-hour work days, things that we take for granted. They were talking about lowering taxes on the working person, raising taxes on the wealthy. These kinds of things that you hear today that kind of sound more like democratic ideals and views, versus the Republican Party, who is trying to hold on to a more conservative idea. And what ends up happening is the conservative voice finds its way to the South, and the South uses that to, I guess, they really manipulate it and pervert the idea of conservatism, and they push it back to the antebellum period. They're pushing it back to a time that America was divided racially, and they're pushing their supremacy ideas. And unfortunately, the Republican Party and the conservative mindset has, I guess, made its way to us today, but it's definitely not the party of Lincoln that it used to be. And I'm not saying the Democrats did this on purpose back in the teens or 20s. They weren't necessarily on board for helping minorities, helping women. It was just de facto, people came to them. The marginalized groups came to them looking for help because they weren't getting it anymore from the Republican Party. So they did it reluctantly. And some would even still argue to this day that it's nothing but lip service that they pay to minorities and women and traditionally marginalized groups just to obtain their vote. And that's really for people to make up their own minds.
Yeah. So now let's touch a little bit about, and you know a lot more about world history than me, because I don't think I've ever had a world history class other than just learning by myself. So maybe talk a little bit about your favorite time in world history. And that's a lot of time to think about, but.
Yeah, that is a long stretch there. Actually, probably I love looking at I love Asia. I love Asian history, and it's really, for me, it's kind of that in India. It's this post-Vedic age, and just a quick background. What the Vedic age is, it's seen as kind of a dark age, and where there isn't a lot of learning taking place, there isn't a lot of advancements via civilization. But I think it's a misnomer to call it a dark age, because it's really a time in which the people of India are developing spiritually. And we see the result of that being what's called Hinduism, and its offshoot of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. So I love seeing these spiritual developments taking place, and then also happening concurrently as these developments are taking place in India and Asia. We see what's happening in Western Asia, the Middle East, with the development of Zoroastrianism leading to Judaism, which is ultimately going to give the foundation for Christianity and Islam. So you have a real spiritual renaissance taking place, or maybe not, renaissance may not be the right word for it, but you have a spiritual boom. And it's about 1,000-year period where this is happening, from roughly about 700 BCE up until about 600 CE with the development of Islam. So all of this happens, all of the world's spiritual developments that are, I guess I should say, all of the major spiritual developments are taking place at this time. And I always just am curious as to why that's happening. What is it in the human experience that is leading to these developments and making people across the globe ask those big questions. Why am I here? And what does it all mean? These kinds of different things. So that to me is probably my favorite time period.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about your favorite. You're really into the unknown stories of history. So maybe tell one of your favorite unknown stories in history.
Oh boy, I really do enjoy digging a little bit deeper, finding those stories that a lot of people haven't heard a lot about, and I guess trying to think here, what would be my favorite one of them all? Maybe it's probably not one of my favorites, but it's something that I think at least needs a little a little acknowledgement. Um, and if I'm going to swing back to U.S. history and kind of swing ourselves up to the civil rights movement that's really gaining steam in the 1950s and on into the 1960s, what ends up happening is an event, or I guess a movement in the South, a focus on Alabama. And I just saw a documentary on this about, I don't know, a month ago. And this guy's name doesn't come out that often because it's overshadowed by a segregationist governor known as George Wallace. But right before George Wallace, there's a segregationist governor known as John Patterson. John Patterson comes to prominence in Alabama really because of unfortunate circumstances. His father's killed by a organized crime syndicate in Alabama, and his father had just been elected Attorney General of Alabama. So John Patterson, who had become a lawyer, was working for his father. He was the natural choice to kind of fill his father's role. And during this time in office as a state's attorney, he is really pushing for economic equality, and he's pushing to get the crime rate lowered and to really tackle some of these big issues that are taking place in Alabama. And he goes to run for governor. I want to say it was 1958, 59. He's running for governor. And this is right at the height of the civil rights movement's beginnings. I mean, it's gaining steam. We're about ready to roll into the 1960s with the sit-ins with Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s rise to prominence. These things are all right at the cusp of happening. And he makes a decision that I would consider fatal to his legacy, historical legacy. He sells out his personal beliefs and becomes a staunch segregationist. He goes out there on the campaign trail. The two people he's running against are pretty moderate. They're listening to the federal government say that changes need to happen. And instead of staying the course and believing in what his father believed, and really, I can't ever know what's in a man's heart, but he sells himself out for the office, and he wins the governorship. He goes on to serve in that capacity until he's replaced by Governor George Wallace in 1963, 64, somewhere in there. But during that time period, he had the opportunity to actually take Alabama from its arcane beginnings and its backward thinking, and he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it. And I watched this documentary. He can't do it because he made promises. And when you make promises on the campaign trail, those are the people who fund your campaign. And then they have expectations once you're actually in office. And he's always looking forward to re-election. But he had the opportunity to make significant change and improve the situation in Alabama a lot faster than it ever did. and he doesn't do it. Those relationships between white and black America are further divided. And I watched this documentary and I hear him talking and I hear his excuses as to why he doesn't do it. And I felt ashamed for him. I mean, it was just one excuse after the other, but it doesn't line up with what he actually did as state's attorney. The state's attorney, he fought crime organizations. He fought people who threatened other people. He fought against those who committed violence against their fellow human being. But then, in a shift in ideology, he all of a sudden starts to blame the victims and blame the people pushing for change and calling them the agitators. And I just wonder how a man does that. I wonder how you sell out in order to win office. He's always stood out to me as somebody that is really the epitome of evil. I mean, he does. He really is. And he doesn't get the recognition that his successor, George Wallace, gets, because Wallace was the one famous that stands in front of the University of Alabama doors and these kinds of different things, trying to prevent segregation. But it's really John Patterson who could have made the change. He had the opportunity, but he just doesn't do it. And his legacy is forever tainted by that unwillingness to act on behalf of humanity. Instead, he acts on behalf of hate. That's what he does.
How often do you think that happens? I mean, even today, how often do you think people, sell their beliefs off just so they can gain a little bit of power?
Well, I'll tell you a story. I had a great friend who we went to middle school, high school, then we ended up at college together. We both became very politically minded, and we had designs on changing the world, and we were very we're very ideological, and we thought that change could happen. We thought that all of it took was the right vision, the right mindset, these kinds of different things. And I still do believe that. I really do. And a lot of people call me or a lot of people tell me that I live in a dream world, but hey, I'd rather live there than in a world that can't change. But I digress. Let's get back on track. He ended up going into politics, and he went in. He didn't want to run for office, but he wanted to manage campaigns. He wanted to be out there stumping. He wanted to be out there doing the legwork, and he ends up doing it. And about 10 years goes by of him doing this, and we've kind of moved on. And I remember talking to him, and he just one day just sounded really defeated. And I was like, "But what's going on?" I mean, and he was winning elections. I mean, his campaigns were winning elections, and he was doing great. And he just said that it's an ugly forum in which to exist, and the ideas don't matter anymore. They don't care. They actually don't care anymore. They don't want the change that they say they want. And I'm talking, I won't say what campaigns he ran, but I'm talking major campaigns. We're talking Congress, we're talking Senate. And he said that it was just, it felt dirty. It felt like he had weight on his soul. And he ended up leaving politics. He couldn't do it anymore because of that. And it was people sell out to the same people, and what they're really doing is they're selling out to the money, and the money is what funds the campaign, and the money is what gets you elected or reelected, and those elections are where the power is at, and that's why it's so important to these individuals. I remember him telling me about the constituents don't matter anymore to people if it ever did. I mean, politics, let's face it. I mean, just because it's that way today, it was that way 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's been like this. Um, but the constituency said doesn't matter to them anymore after they get elected. What matters is winning support and influence in whatever house or whatever branch they're in. And once that happens, once they get that influence there, then they start worrying about re-election. So they'll start talking to their constituents again. But it's all driven by money. And he said that was the most discouraging thing. And I don't know if you remember from class, I said, well, there's a historical fact, and this isn't just true in America. It isn't just true in United States history. It's true across the world. Follow the money. If you follow the money, you typically find the answers you're looking for. So I guess that's a long way to answer the question. That yes, people are still doing it today, and probably at a rate that would make you kind of that would shock you that they sell out in order for the election. They sell their values for the election.
Yeah, I think the word for that is plutocracy, and I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the word for basically if you're rich, you can get into office, and if you have the money, that's when you get into office. So I think that, I mean, whatever political affiliation you have or whatever, I think everybody can agree that money in politics is corrosive, it's disgusting, and it probably needs to get, somehow it needs to get out. I don't know if that's publicly funded elections. I mean, there's ways you can get rid of it. But, I mean, when you have politicians getting bought day in and day out by, whether it be corporations or powerful people to do their bidding, I mean, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, that's corruption at its finest. So whatever political party you're affiliated with, I think you can agree that getting money out of politics is a huge issue that needs to be accomplished.
Well, I remember hearing pretty good one-liner. I don't know, it must have been a year, or not a year. It was either this past election or the one before it. They said it's the only time you'll see a person pay $1 billion to get a job that only pays them $400,000 a year. So the money is corrosive, as you had said. I like that word. It's corrosive. And I know that it's been, at least people have attempted to address it in politics at various points over the years. And the problem is it's the financing that got them there. And trying to get everybody on board to say, let's get rid of the dirty money is not an easy task to do.
Yeah. So let's switch gears. Let's talk about people, because that's what you like to focus on. This could be a movement of people, or it could be specific leaders. But who would you say are, let's do like top 3 people or movements in history that you really appreciate and you can get behind and like?
Without a doubt, the civil rights movement is the number one. It's a mass movement that I think is oftentimes misunderstood as to what the goal really was. Excuse me. Sorry about that. No, people misunderstand what the goal really was. I don't think the civil rights, well, I know the civil rights movement wasn't about 2 races saying all of a sudden we get along, we like each other. What it was really about was for one group of people demanding to be treated as equals, as men and women. And that was it. That's what it is. It's about equal treatment, not only in the economic sphere, but the social sphere, the political sphere. It's just equality. There was never signs people wore that said, you must like me. And there was never a sign that says, I want to like you. That was never it. It was signs, I'm a man. That's a very powerful sign. It's a sign that says, treat me as an individual, as a human being. That's it. And that message resonated and moves down through the decades and provides, I guess, the space for the other social movements, which the reason why I choose the civil rights movement as being so important is because what happens next is really fascinating. And that is the 1970s, the 1980s, when other marginalized groups see the successes. I don't want to say that the civil rights movement has succeeded. I think there's still a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of, I guess, ground to cover before there's equality, but it empowered the women's rights movement, or I guess what we call the feminist movement, the second feminist movement. There was a idea back in the 19 teens, the early 19, well, really the latter half of the 1800s and the early 1900s, that if women got the right to vote, that would allow them to be equal. And they quickly found out that that wasn't the case. So the 1970s, we see the women's rights movement. We see the gay rights movement. We see what's called the Chicano movement. And these groups of marginalized people use the same tactics that those in the civil rights, the original civil rights movement, were using to get that that equal treatment afforded to them, get legislation passed, get equality in the workforce, get representation in the political world. So the impact of the civil rights movement is profound beyond what people realize, and it's still being utilized to this day. Next month in June, you'll encounter what's called Gay Pride Day. However, it's labeled in late June. What people don't realize is the reason they're celebrating that or commemorating that is it's the beginning of the gay rights movement that is really honoring an event that happened in Greenwich Village in New York called the Stonewall Riots. And it was when a group of individuals, gay individuals, decided to fight back against oppression by the police, by individuals who had called them mental defects. I mean, that's literally they were in the they were treated as such, and they began to fight back, and they find an ally in the civil rights movement in the 1970s, 1980s. They find an ally that's going to support them, and that's the civil rights movement. Women's rights. In March, we just had the Women's History Month, and the reason it's in March is the same reason, because these certain events that take place, these landmark events that take place in those months, really are the catalyst to their various movements. So the civil rights movement for me is number one, and then right behind it are those various other social movements that take place that have really at least elevated the marginalized groups. Obviously, there's a long way to go before there's true equality in this country, but there's at least there's momentum. There's momentum, and it's because of those efforts by the individuals in the civil rights movement.
Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about underappreciated people, or maybe even movements in United States history.
Without a doubt, to me, it's the labor movement. As far as the underappreciated, the labor movement, really, I call them the labor wars. that were taking place in the late early 1900s by individuals who were asking for things like 40-hour work week, asking for things like breaks while they're at work, asking for nice or better working conditions like lights and windows so they'd have fresh air in factories. Things that we kind of find ridiculous and find laughable, they were not guaranteed to people. And the suffering, the horrific suffering that individuals endured to make this country stuff, the material stuff that builds the country, the widgets that people buy to garner this amazing escalation in wealth, is on the backs of children, on the backs of immigrants, on the backs of everyday working people who, quite frankly, were not even considered human. They were just part of the machine. They were a cog in this machine that's making it all go. And at some point, somewhere along the line, somebody stopped and said, you know what, this isn't right. This is not the pinnacle of humanity. This isn't where we need to be in society. This isn't how life should be, that we work 16 hours a day, sleep for a few, starve, live 10 families to a tenement house. It's mind-boggling. And they come out, and their only weapon that they have is to say, we're not going to do this. We're not going to work today. We're going to stop making the widgets. We're going to stop mining the coal. We're going to stop producing the steel, whatever it is. That was their only weapon they had. And they did, administer these work stoppages, and with varying degrees of success. But I always found one quote, I'm forgetting who actually had said it, but it was individuals in what was called the IWW, which better known as the Wobbly. It said, you know, if we all stop working, the system stops. And that's essentially what happens, is you shut down the economy and everything stops. You shut down production, everything stops. So it's a very effective weapon. And we also have to, I guess, look at it from the other side. If you start messing with people's money, then they're going to retaliate. If you stop production, you stop working, you start complaining about conditions, there's going to be a response. And a lot of times that response was violent, and people lost their lives. These were greedy corporate thugs that were unleashing paramilitary groups on employees who were complaining about working conditions. And these individuals stayed the course. They fought an amazing fight to get the respect and to get the, I guess, respect is maybe not the right word, get acknowledged for their efforts. And a lot of things that we take for granted today, like those work weeks, like vacation time, like medical benefits, these kinds of things that you look for when you get a job. I mean, you're a young student, you're going to go out in the workforce, and you're going to probably look for a job that's going to offer you things like a retirement package, those medical benefits, paid vacations, these kinds of different things. That was unheard of 110, 130, 150 years ago. People fought, they died in order for us to have those luxuries. And that's the one area of history, U.S. history, that unfortunately is not given the treatment, I believe, that it deserves. And it could be integrated into curriculum very, very easily. but it's just overlooked, and it goes against the grain of what we think of as America. Because if you're looking at America, you're looking at the Industrial Revolution, you're looking at the industrial might, and that's where America really sees this. They see the trajectory of America's wealth and prominence go sky high at this time period. Well, they don't tell you about whose backs were broken in order to make that possible.
Yeah. And I mean, that led to, I mean, things we see today too, like strikes, unions, and stuff like that. So, I mean,
and still to this day, you see unions demonized in politics. You see them demonized in everyday life. But those unions were the reason we have the luxuries that we have to this day. And my hat's off to those individuals in the past and the efforts that they made to make life what it is for us today.
Yeah. So last of my favorite questions, there's tons of mysteries in history, and that rhymes, so that's pretty cool. But there's the JFK, who really killed JFK. Recently there's like the Malaysia Flight 370, what happened to that plane. So what would you say is your favorite unsolved story in history or unresolved thing in history, if you talk a little bit?
I always tell my Asian history students that there isn't a lot of ways to get extremely wealthy as a historian, but if you find where Genghis Khan's buried, you'll be extremely wealthy. The fact that this individual named Genghis Khan has such a impact on U.S. or on world history is baffling, that we have no clue where he is buried. And it's one of those things that's always kind of left me scratching my head. But probably what I would really like to know most, and it's something that's actually possible, and that is the first emperor of China. His name is Shi Huangdi. And many people are familiar with at least one aspect of his burial complex, and that's what's known as the terracotta soldiers.
Yep.
This individual has an entire army made to escort him into the afterlife. And these soldiers are strategically placed around his burial mound. Well, the burial mound has never been investigated, it's never been. We've never been able to get in it. We've never been able to take a look and see what's actually in the burial ground. And there's rumors abound as to what might be in there. And the one that's always kind of stood out to me was that there's a possible city that was created underneath the ground, and it's got flowing rivers of mercury and this kind of stuff. I guess being able to open the door on that burial tomb and have it excavated, or at least to look inside, would be a pretty incredible thing. Unfortunately, navigating that with the Chinese government, who has the control of that tomb, is not, I guess we're not going to see it opened anytime soon. But that would be one of those that I would really like to know what's going on, what's happening inside there.
What about the pyramids?
The pyramids, I actually teach a course in the summer for younger students called Histories, Mysteries, and we go through and we solve a couple of different things. And one of the, solve, quote unquote, solve them, but one of them is the pyramids and what were they built for. And most people think they're built in their tombs for pharaohs, but there's never been a pharaoh found in any of them. I mean, we found pharaohs all over Egypt. We found various burial sites for these renowned leaders, but there's never been a a pharaoh or even evidence that one has existed in any of these tombs. So what were they really built for? We are still scratching our heads on that. But probably what I think is a mystery that's going to be solved, or at least we're going to see movement in its direction. And it's not a specific event that took place. It's going to be an unveiling of history in probably the next 2 to 3 decades as we shift our focus down to Central and South America. These are areas that have gone, frankly, largely ignored by mainstream historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and not for any other reason than interest. And people have not had much interest outside of the Aztecs, outside of the Mayans and the Inca, the major big kingdoms that were there, or civilizations that were there. But I think what we're going to find as we really start digging into Central and South America is a history that hasn't been told yet. And that to me is what is most exciting. And I think we're going to be on the leading edge of that here in the next couple of decades coming forward. And I've taken a South American history course, and I've talked with various individuals who their focus is on South America and Central America. And one of the difficulties, especially for early historians, outside of getting people interested in that history, was always access, trying to get into these dense jungles. We don't know what's been grown over. And as people go through these jungles, and we have means to get in there now and see some of these civilizational or these developments that have taken place, I think we're going to see some really exciting stories coming out of this. We're going to learn a lot about people of the quote-unquote New World, which quite frankly is a misnomer in itself, that it's got such a deep history. And I'm really anxious to see what that deep history, what are those stories that are going to come from these eager historians getting down there right now and starting to unearth these amazing histories.
Yeah. And I probably am going to butcher this, but there's some fact, because I know you just talked about the pyramids, then you talked about South America, so it kind of reminded me. I think South America is, you can grow coffee beans there. And in Egypt, you can't. There's nowhere in Egypt you can. But there are coffee beans found in a lot of pharaohs' tombs and caskets and everything like that. So that's a mystery in itself too. Like, were Egyptians going across the ocean and, I mean, speaking with these tribes? Or I don't know. There's all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of those little head scratchers. There's this, how'd this end up there? This doesn't fit in the narrative. These two civilizations should never have actually had contact, but why do we see these artifacts, these cross-cultural contaminations, if you will, between peoples? We don't know as much as we think we do. I'll be quite honest. We believe we know a whole lot, which to a certain extent we might, but we don't know nearly as much as we think we do. And those histories are going to be unearthed, and we're going to continue learning more. And this, I'll actually tell you, the reason we don't know as much as we think we do is because of the focal point of history. And for so long, we have focused on kings, queens, pharaohs, major wars, battles, this, that, and the other. But now that we're actually taking the microscope off of those individuals and those events and putting it onto what I feel matters, and that's the people. And now that we're putting the microscope on the people, we're starting to answer a lot of these questions that, quite frankly, weren't answerable because of because of the hyper focus on these individuals that we consider great in history. I'll let you make up your mind as to who you consider great, not great. But once we kind of pull the lens back and we start to look at a more broader group of individuals, I think we're going to answer a lot of questions. We're going to learn a lot more than we ever did before by just looking at certain individuals and focusing on what I call the black holes of history, these names and figures that seem to dominate the narrative. Time to say, okay, let's move our focus away from that.
Yeah, and me and you could probably do a whole other podcast talking about like mysteries in history, I guess you would call them, which would be awesome. But last question, and in your professional opinion, who killed JFK?
We should do a podcast on history's mysteries. I'd love to do that with you. Who killed JFK? That's a real good question.
You're gonna have the FBI knocking on your door real quick because you know.
Yeah. The one thing I could probably say for certain is it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, outside of that, boy, you could
the mob, the CIA, the Russians.
Those are three big names. You know, those are three leading contenders in that conversation. I don't know, but if Lee Harvey Oswald did do it, I will say he's the best shot ever that's existed in the history of mankind. So, but aside from, boy, you know, it just. I hate to say the CIA, but boy, it just has an odor of CIA. Let me tell you.
Yeah, and last thing before we start to close things out here, I think conspiracy theories like that actually have weight to them are extremely interesting, and I hate conspiracy theories like chemtrails or something like that makes you seem crazy. Like if you don't think if you don't believe the official story with JFK, you're kind of thrown in the lump of people who believe chemtrails are true and that the government's run by lizard people. So I think that those kind of conspiracy theories completely overshadow like ones that actually like are credible and have real weight to them. But,
I think the government has done a great job of discrediting people who question it. And if you don't believe the published narrative that is put out there, then that label of conspiracy theorist gets attached to you pretty quickly. And it's an effective control mechanism. And I always tell students or tell anybody, don't rely on the official word from your government, or don't rely on somebody's interpretation of the official word from the government. You know, go look at the information yourself. Go look at the actual documents that the government looked at, if you have access to them, which let's just say a lot of us don't. And if they don't provide you with access to the documents that they've made their decisions and they've made their official statement based on, then you have reason to question. If you're not given public access to that information, you have reason to question it, because there shouldn't be anything to hide. And the broad stroke of saying public or national security, I think, is just a parlor trick used by the government to really hide things from their employers, which are the American people. So, but I always tell people, don't listen to the talking heads at night. I mean, you can for entertainment purposes. But you have to, they're in the entertainment industry. That's what they do. Yeah. Go find the information yourself. Make up your own mind, and always be flexible. Always be ready to change your mind based on new information, which is totally acceptable. I think a lot of people don't realize that it's okay that you can change your mind when you get new information. Being a flexible human being is a value to society.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any last minute thoughts or ideas that you want to run with? Otherwise, we can close things out and save it for another podcast.
Well, I guess my real last minute thought is thanks a lot, Sam. I'm glad you're doing this. I think this is fantastic. I don't know if you realize the value that this is going to have, not only for you, your family, your friends, but for posterity. And as we move into this digital world and the information contained in platforms like this are going to be seen by future generations, and you're telling a story, you're providing a primary resource for future research, and I think that's awesome. I think what you're doing is amazing. I encourage you to keep it up and have a diverse diverse voice as far as guests are concerned. And I've watched a few of the ones that you've done in the past. You really do a good job of bringing people in and putting it out there. I think you'll probably look back at some of these 20 years, 30 years from now. You'll probably laugh a little bit and be like, boy, I can't believe I thought that, or I didn't ask this question, or I did it. Just know what you're doing is a really great thing for more than just the people who are watching it now. It's a great thing for those that are going to be watching it in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And if you take classes at SCC and you're signing up next semester for next year, make sure you get Mr. Bell on the schedule. He's awesome. With all that being said, that was Mr. Blake Bell.